Hey everyone, it's Matt here with Nightrun Studio, and we are finally here. We're finally going to make some dialogue appear on the screen. So far in this series, we've set up a nice looking dialogue canvas. We've got an NPC talk state where we can walk to our NPC and have a dialogue icon pop up, and we've written a bunch of great dialogue. However, none of it's linked together. In this video, we're going to create a dialogue manager that will handle bringing all of that together. We'll make it so we can turn the dialogue on and off, progress through it, and while we won't get to choices and some of the fancier stuff just yet, we've got a lot ahead of us. So let's go ahead and get started. Now the very first thing I'm going to do is just create a new folder called dialogue scripts, as we're going to have a couple of these. Let's create a new C# script here called dialogue manager. Alright, let's get rid of these start and update methods and start with some variables. First, we're going to make a header for UI references, as we're going to have a number of these. While we're at it, let's head up to our namespaces. We can get rid of everything but Unity Engine, and then we're just going to add back using unityengine.ui, and also set things up for our TextMesh Pro by adding that namespace as well. Now we can make a public image called portrait. We're also going to add a public TMP text, which is going to be our actor name, and finally one more public TMP text for the actual text. Now, because this manager will manage all of our dialogue, we need it to be able to keep track of the current dialogue SO that it's using. Remember, we created that in the last video, and each dialogue SO is full of lines that include both the speaker's actor SO as well as the text that he's going to say. Since our dialogue will have multiple lines, we're going to need an integer called dialogue index, which will just keep track of which line of the text we're currently on. Next, let's create a private void method called showDialog, which will handle actually updating all of our name, text, and images for the canvas. We'll start by grabbing the line of dialogue we're currently looking at. Remember, dialogue line includes both the actor scriptable object and the text he's going to say. We'll just call this line, and we're going to make it equal to our current dialogue.line. And here in the square brackets, we're just going to put the number of whatever current line we're on, and we'll just increment this each time we press the button. So let's go ahead and add dialogue index ++, which will just make it go up by 1 each time we show a new line of dialogue. Now each time we call show dialogue, we want to update the sprite on our portrait in the canvas. We'll do this by just saying that it's equal to the current line of text's speaker's portrait. We'll also make sure that the name has its text updated so that it goes to the current line, grabs our speaker, which is the actor SO, and uses his name. Finally, we'll make sure that the dialogue text box has its text set to whatever the current line of dialogue's text should be. This will handle updating our canvas with all of the relevant data we need to show. Now, I always like to test things early and make sure it's working, so we're just going to add a temporary start method here, which we'll call showDialog. And we'll just change our dialogue scriptable object to be public for the moment. Now when we get into Unity, we can click on the dialogue canvas, go ahead and add our dialogue manager, and we're just going to have a little bit of setup to do there. Let's open up our canvas's drop-down menus and go ahead and fill them. So first of all, we'll just grab the portrait image and put that into our portrait. We'll grab our name text for the actor name. We're going to want dialogue text to go in the dialogue text. And for current dialogue, we've just got the one that we created in the last video, so let's go ahead and add greeting with Bob. At this point, I'm just going to look at our dialogue canvas, which is going to start, you'll see, with Bob the NPC at the top, and a whole bunch of new text lines. When I hit play, this should all update to have the information from our dialogue scriptable object. And just like that, you'll see that Bob's name changed, our first line of text appears, and Bob the NPC is showing up in the portrait, though he was already there, so that's not particularly exciting. All right, that's working nicely. Now let's make it so we can actually advance through this dialogue. Now, in order for an NPC to actually find the dialogue manager, we need a way for them to talk to it. To do this, we're just going to make a public static dialogue manager called instance. And then in our awake method, we're just going to do a check. If instance is null, meaning there's no other dialogue manager in our game, then we want to set this as the actual instance. Then we'll add an else statement, because if there's already a dialogue manager around, then we want to destroy the new invader and make sure that we don't have multiple dialogue managers running around in our game. With that done, our NPC talk state will now have easy access to the dialogue manager in order to pass along whatever conversation we need to have. We just have a couple of lines to add now to NPC talk. First of all, we want to make a public dialogue SO so that we can give him the conversation he's going to have. We're then going to come down below the onDisable method here and add an update method, which will just check for a button press. In this case, we're just going to check if there's an input, and in this case, we'll use get button down, interact. If there is, we want to talk to our dialog manager. But here we run into a problem, as we don't want to start a new dialog if there's one already running, and so we need a way to check whether or not we've already initiated the current dialog. So let's pop over to our dialog manager, and here we'll just add a public bool called isDialogActive. I'm also just going to set the current dialog SO back to private and get rid of the start method, as those were just added for testing. Now while we're here, when our NPC talk wants to start a new dialog, it's going to need a method that it can call. So let's make a public void start dialog method here. And this is just going to take in a scriptable object with whatever dialog we want to start. So as soon as that happens, we'll set this script's current dialog to be equal to whatever dialog scriptable object was just passed in. And at that point, we'll just call showDialog, which will begin actually showing the dialog that was just passed along from our NPC. Now back in our NPC, we can finish this check. So if our dialog manager.instance.isDialogActive, meaning if there's already a conversation on the go, then we're going to want to advance the dialog to the next one. We'll create that method in just a sec. Let's add an else statement though, because if the dialog is not already active, we're going to want to call that method we just created. So we can say dialog manager.instance.startDialog. And don't forget to pass along the scriptable object with all of the dialog data. Now before we'll be able to test, we'll just have to actually add that advanced dialog. So let's go to our dialog manager. And so now if we're not starting a new dialog but just want to advance a current one, we'll call this method. Here, we're just going to use an if statement first of all and add a protective check. This is just going to check to see if our dialog index is less than, and here it's just going to look at the current dialog lines and see how long they are. This will allow us to recognize when the dialog is over, and we'll add a feature for that in just a moment. Now, if however there is still dialog remaining, we'd want to call showDialog, which itself will increment at the end, and so each time we call this, it'll just show the next line. Now, in our NPC talk, we can just make it so that if the dialog's currently active, we'll call that advanced dialog method when we push the button. Now you'll notice in Unity that our dialog manager no longer has a scriptable object, which is as it should be. We need to make sure that NPC talk does have one so that it can actually call the conversation. And now when we get in the game, we have our annoying default text showing up. Don't worry, we'll deal with that. However, when I walk up to the NPC and push a button, you'll notice that our dialog is in fact starting. If I push the button again, it advances, it keeps doing that. However, at the end, if I push the button one more time, we get an error message. Now, if we take a look at that error message, we can see that it's pointing to our showDialog method, and it's just upset that our index is outside the bounds of the array. This is actually just telling us that something went wrong with our check, which is only supposed to advance dialog if the dialog index is less than the number of lines. We do have a defensive check in here, but it doesn't seem to be working. Now the reason for that is simply that we created this terrific bool, isDialogActive, but we're not actually triggering it on or off at any point. So let's go ahead and fix that. So anytime we start a new dialog, let's make sure our dialog index gets set to 0, and let's also make sure that the isDialogActive bool is set to true. What was happening before is we were just calling start dialog all the time, as we were never turning on the dialogActive bool. Now in advanced dialog, we'll add an else statement here so that if we run out of dialog lines, we'll call a new endDialog method. We can go ahead and make that method now. Here we'll do something similar to what we did in start. We'll set our dialog index to 0. Admittedly, doing this twice isn't necessarily totally needed, but I'm just gonna be double safe here. And at the same time, we'll also set our isDialogActive to false, as now the dialog is in fact ended. With that little tweak, things should be working properly now so that we can push the buttons, and if I push again at the end, nothing will happen. That's because the dialog's over, and another push, rather than erroring, will now start the conversation over again. Now obviously, we want the dialog to actually disappear when we're done, and we also want to make it so that it's not there at start, so let's just add that functionality now. While we're at it, you may have noticed that my attack and interact button are the same. So I'm just gonna head into the input manager, where I'm just gonna quickly check it. You'll see that my interact is set up as K, but when I go down to slash, it's also K. I'm just gonna move my slash to J so that I'm not doing both at the same time. All right, now in order to toggle things on and off, we're gonna make a public canvas group reference, and I'll just call it canvas group. You'll remember in Unity that we put this on the canvas at the top, and it just allows us to change the alpha to make things disappear. We can also toggle whether or not these buttons and things are interactable and whether or not all of this will block raycast. These are currently set to off, however, we're going to want to be able to toggle them in the script, especially later on once we add buttons. So now we'll head down to our awake method, and here we'll just make sure that at the start of the game, the canvas group's alpha is set to 0, that its interactability is set to false, and also that its block raycast is set to false. I'll copy those lines of code, and now in show dialog, we'll paste them in and just do the opposite. Whenever we want to show dialog, we'll make sure that the alpha is set to 1 and that interactable and blocking raycasts are true. We'll copy all that one last time so that when we end the dialog, we turn it all off again. I realize this is a little redundant, and we'll come up with a slightly more elegant way of doing this in the next video, as well as a fade so that our canvas doesn't just toggle on and off in a harsh way, but I want to keep it simple for this video. Now with those updates, we can go ahead and make sure that we've got a reference to our canvas group. So let's just drag that in there, and then we can hit play. All right, so now as soon as we begin the game, it toggles the canvas off. We can walk up to our NPC, and when we push a button, the conversation begins. We can advance through nicely, and then at the end, it disappears. All right, that's working really nicely. We've still got some work to do in terms of adding options and branches and different types of text, but we'll get there in the next video. I hope to see you in that one. Until that time, this is Matt with Night Run Studio. Cheers.